Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I am joined today by Professor Philip Jenkins, who is here today to discuss his latest book, American Empire, American Faith. Philip Jenkins is the Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor University and a very well-known author of many books, several with us here at Baylor University Press. We're really honored to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, I'm very excited about this book. I've just finished it, and it is an exceptional account of American history and the interplay between American religion and American empire. And I would imagine, though, that as I say those words, that listeners might think, American empire, what are we talking about? Because we are not in the habit in America of thinking of ourselves as an empire. In fact, we tend to think of ourselves as kind of anti-imperialists. You know, we're the ones who rose up against the monarchs and all that. So could you maybe just start us off by explaining, what do you mean? And are you just being controversialist by referring to America as an empire? How do you understand America in those terms?
Well, there's a very strong popular theme of regarding empires as the enemy. You only need to look at Star Wars for that. What are they fighting if not the empire? In the last 40 years or so, the idea of American empire has gone from being a maybe quirky and controversial idea to being close to being a absolutely mainstream approach to studying American history. And if you look, for instance, at book titles, you can look at the history of American botany, of Scandinavian settlement in the American Midwest. And the subtitle, look how many of them feature the phrase empire. It has become almost the indispensable lens for studying American history. So partly it's normalizing America alongside the other great Western nations. But it's one of these where when you look at the idea more closely, you see how natural and even inevitable it is. So am I being maybe quirky or controversial? I don't think so on this occasion. But that is just such a standard way these days.
So I suppose that if, maybe more historically informed listeners might think of the American empire and you think of the Philippines or Guam exactly. or Hawaii and some of these overseas locations. But you make it a point that actually from the get-go, America is an experience of imperial expansion. Could you unpack some of that for us?
Sure. If you look at the words of the founding fathers, if you look at the remarks of George Washington, they will very regularly talk about how we are building our empire, continuing our empire, and that has gone through all the way. Now, the interesting idea then is when you look at many nations around the world, like Britain or France or Italy, there is a home country. And then there is a range of imperial territories. So in Britain, it might be India, Nigeria. Okay, so you have a core and a periphery. In the case of America, of the United States, where is the core? And many people would say, okay, it's the United States as it was created in 1789 with the Constitution. Although even then, there are a lot of unconquered Native American territories there. So is Ohio the first conquest of the American empire? What about Texas? What about the West Coast? These are areas that retroactively we think of are inevitably part of the American homeland, the lower 48, the core of the United States. But things could have worked out very differently. It's possible to imagine an alternative scenario where the U.S. acquired more territory, Cuba, Canada, Mexico, or less, where, for example, they did not acquire the West Coast or Texas. I like to look at empire in that way as a key process of American history rather than a fact. And when they reach the West Coast, then they reach out further, then they reach to Alaska and Hawaii and so on. but they're dealing with the same issues. And may I just say, that is another major theme in the way people write history, how there's a continuity from, for example, the, quote, Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s to the colonial wars of the 1890s. It's the same process, the same people. So essential to understanding American history, is Texas part of the American empire? Well, we can discuss this.
Yes. Okay. So there's something maybe historically contingent about the from sea to shining sea of America, that it didn't have to stop there and it didn't have to go there fully. But the fact that it does this process of expansion, and then that expansion reaches certain limits, that you're suggesting that all of that is indicative of an imperial program, not a kind of given, maybe a nation state.
Exactly. And that is, if you like, a key realization for many historians of the United States these days.
Okay. And where does religion then fit into that? Because there are probably quite a few accounts of the American empire as a historical reality. But what you're bringing to the table is as a historian of American religion in particular. So where does religion fit in?
Good. I've written quite a lot about the idea of empire and religion, not just the United States. Yeah. Empire makes religion, religion makes empire. And by that, I mean that empire creates the conditions in which religions, and particular religions, can rise and fall. They spread people, communications, transportation. They establish common languages. They draw in immigrants. And the great religions of the world rise and fall through that. If you apply those ideas to the United States, then it works in two ways. Partly the ideologies that lead American imperial expansion are absolutely saturated in the Bible, in religious language, in religious rhetoric. They're absolutely suffused in particularly the Old Testament, the conquest of Canaan, so much of that language. And most famously, of course, in the whole idea of manifest destiny in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, as that is framed, that does not make too many references to God or the Bible. But it's destiny, it's manifest, it's providence. And by the way, whenever they use these words, they always use them with capital letters, making clear that these are personified forces. If you go to any kind of religious institution, you will hear this as, this is what the United States is doing. God has told us to do this. So empire makes American religion in ways we can talk about in a moment. But the fact of empire, the idea of empire, is profoundly shaped by religious ideas, which in the US context overwhelmingly are Protestant, evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, and we'll put this up on the screen for viewers, but the cover of the book is really quite striking, and you have this kind of angelic figure crossing the American plains and carrying a telegraph wire, and there's all of the kind of westward expansion iconography in the background beneath her, spreading from a city out west, and it's a remarkable image of manifest destiny, right, of this American westward expansion. And I suppose then that what you're not suggesting, or what you're not saying, is that, Christianity caused America to be imperialist. And maybe not the opposite either, that American Christianity just is pure imperialism as a result of it, but that there is a kind of blending. Could you unpack some of the complex ways that religion and empire are feeding into one another, and maybe in tension with one another, in the American imperialist project?
Sure. That idea of unpacking is absolutely critical, and simplistic is something I try never to do. But when people argue these issues, they cannot fail to do them in terms of the ideological assumptions they have, which, as I say, are Christian and Protestant. In the generation or so before the Civil War, there is an absolutely fundamental debate over imperial expansion. Should the U.S. expand into the Caribbean, into Central America, into South America? And the people who believe that constantly invoke God and the needs of a Christian race, and people use that language. The people who fight it most strongly because they believe that's a program for the expansion of slavery, they invoke God at least as strongly. And if there is a mainstream of Protestant Christianity in the Northeast and in New England in that era, it believes in a kind of national destiny, but one that is not tied to expansion. And incidentally, Texas itself is at the core of many of these debates. God wants us to have Texas. God absolutely does not want us to have Texas.
So it really is all about Texas in the end.
Of course.
I suspected as much, but it's good to have a historian.
Of course, Texas and God.
Okay, right. It's hard to distinguish the two sometimes around here.
Of course.
Okay, so there is, in one sense, there's an enormous amount of tension of two ways of approaching empire, some in favor, some against.
Yep.
And maybe we could think kind of chronologically here. That might be a neat way to move forward. So if we're thinking right after the Revolutionary War, and then we move toward a kind of westward expansion and up into the Civil War, you have this idea of manifest destiny, that God has destined this.
Sure.
And is there any kind of anti-imperialist rhetoric from that period?
There is. It is not a dominant strand, but some of it is amazing. Right at the start of the century, you have a Washington Irving, who's one of the great American writers, and he writes a satire of what happens when the kingdom of the moon invades Earth and the rhetoric they use. That's from 1809. And every single argument of later anti-imperialism is in that, but above all in the sense of the religious rhetoric that the conquerors would use against, dare I say, native peoples. So in other words, it's the people of the earth who will be forced, most of whom will be exterminated, but the few survivors will have to accept the religion of the moon, which is the lunatic religion. And for Washington Irving, when he looked at Christian missionaries trying to convert Native Americans, he thought this was lunacy. And the idea of missions, evangelism, and empire as a very cynical package, that idea is right there from the beginning.
Wow.
Now, like I say, that is absolutely not a dominant theme, but there is constantly dialogue, debate. In the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson is trying to expel the civilized tribes from the American South, there are people who will speak very strongly in terms of this is part of our national destiny. And there are missionaries on the ground, white American missionaries, who will be thrown into prison for trying to protect the civilized tribes on the grounds of what they believe the demands of God to be. America is an empire. America fights out its imperial debates through religion, but it fights them, it debates them, and in each particular crisis, you can find so many voices against empire and expansion. And empire also stirring up those seditious and radical voices.
Yeah.
And it's that dialogue which is of interest to me.
Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned Native Americans, and could you talk about the role that the Native Americans play in this, and then also the role that African Americans play in this process, particularly leading up to the Civil War and that kind of earlier period of American history, and the role that religion plays and how those populations are understood?
Sure. I mentioned the Old Testament ideas, and often when white Americans are expanding, the concepts they use, the rhetoric they use against Native Americans is the language of Canaanites and Amalekites who must not only be driven from the land, but actively destroyed. There's quite a strong rhetoric of extermination there. It is justified in religious terms. I would actually argue we're familiar with many, quote, Indian wars in the late 19th century. I'm so struck at how many of these are religious wars on both sides. Often they are led by Native Americans who have been sufficiently exposed to the Bible, to evangelical Christianity, that they've taken aboard the ideas of prophecy, of revelation, of the last days. And so they are fighting an apocalyptic millenarian war against white expansion. And the white expansionists are using the language of the Bible. So I think it is impossible to understand these conflicts except in terms of clashing interpretations of religion. Often I think we tend to think of Native Americans as just being the subjects of dreadful things that are being unleashed upon them. Of course not. They're extremely active and often very creative. I mean, the worst shock the early United States has is a war against Tecumseh and his brother, the Shawnee Prophet, who are absolutely suffused in these religious ideas. And they see the mission of God in terms of uniting Native American peoples against this evil empire.
Interesting. Yeah. That was a fascinating way in which you see Native Americans taking on board certain aspects of the white religion that has been imported to the continent.
And often you can see it following directly. So everyone who knows anything about American religious history knows about the great revivals of 1798, the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
And then you look at the native prophets who themselves are inspired by the Great Awakening. And again in the 1840s, and right up to the most famous or notorious instance of all, the ghost dance movement of the 1880s, which again has a very heavy dose of mystical evangelical prophecy in it. And that, of course, culminates in the Wounded Knee Massacre.
Right.
So, like I said, you could actually write a history of America's Indian wars, unquote, as religious wars on both sides.
Wow. Fascinating. I mean, really and truly, the complexity of that is astounding. And I mean, I think we all probably could have suspected that this was all shot through with religious ideology and rhetoric, but to see the real texture of it and the surprising way that it gets worked out, I think is one of the really revelatory aspects of your book.
Thank you.
And how does that play out then in relation to slavery and African Americans?
Well, in so many ways, it is parallel to that. Although, of course, Black Americans have far less agency. They're far less able to organize things themselves. But if anyone tried to write a history of Black America without putting those Black churches front and center at every stage, it is a losing game. So you have white Americans who are using the Bible to justify slavery, the expansion of slavery, who are speaking about the will of God. But at every point, the more Black Americans are exposed to this, the more they develop their own ideologies of, certainly of resistance, but of self-value, self-worth, self-justification. And that proceeds from the 1790s onward. And incidentally, one interesting thing is how these different movements intersect. So when you get a great debate over imperialism, like you do in the 1890s, there are all these great white religious voices, but it's also when you get the Black religious voices, you get the great Black leaders, and also some very remarkable Native American leaders speaking against empire. A life of Frederick Douglass, who was one of the great exponents of that prophetic rhetoric.
Yeah. And you mentioned this, some of the complexities of the ways in which African religions, which had come over with slavery, but had by and large been forcibly exterminated. They were certainly not welcome among the slave populations by their white overlords. But could you talk about the ways that some of that fed into some of these perceptions of empire, but then also some of the white reaction against African American populations?
Sure. That is a continuing theme, and it actually has a focus, which again, a problem I had writing this book, it kept threatening to spin off into multiple different books. And one of the most interesting is Haiti. A lot of American concepts about race are formed by creating these nightmare demonized figures of Haiti as what happens when African populations are freed from white control and revert to their native savagery. And what that means in terms of pagan worship, snake worship, and human sacrifice. So you have this vision of genocidal attempts against white population. So that there's a kind of ultimate nightmare right into the 1920s and 1930s. And that is a sort of a mixed heritage for white people, because for very segregation-minded people, it says we absolutely have to maintain control, or else this is what is seething under the surface. Black intellectual and cultural figures look at Haiti, and obviously they have a much more benevolent view of that tradition. But they, I hate to say it, they play with it. Zora Neale Hurston, for example, plays with it as this is the nightmare we can use against white people. This is something we can use to unnerve white people. And so there is again, I use this phrase again, a dialogue within the United States over race and religion, but it grows out of that imperial encounter. 1915 to 1930, the U.S. occupies Haiti. Haiti voodoo are in the newspapers on like a daily basis, and that spills over into accounts of black religion in the United States. When Black Islam arises, the Nation of Islam, it's always called the Black Voodoo cult.
Interesting.
And it has, of course, anyone who knows anything about Islam has got nothing whatever to do with voodoo.
Yeah.
But it talks about the stereotypes that whites develop on the frontier of empire, which blow back home and affect policies in American cities.
Wow, that's really interesting. So the American imperial experience in Haiti is now informing their stereotypes with which they're understanding their kind of the political situation at home.
And incidentally, one other theme that I try and talk about a lot, and that spills over into 100, into 500 popular culture manifestations in terms of books, in terms of pulp magazines, in terms of films. And if you look in the 19th century, well, you don't have the films, but so many of the ideas of empire and the debates of empire are expressed not in learned tracts or sermons. They're in novels, they're in comic books, they're in cartoons, visual illustrations. An American in 1890 might say that he or she knows nothing at all about empire, but if you look inside their mind and the cultural images that are there, they're absolutely shaping that person's thinking unwittingly.
Wow. And so you bring up Haiti, and that kind of broadens the perspective here from the continental U.S. to the kind of America's backyard, as it's been referred to, the Caribbean, Central America, South America. Could you talk about American imperial presence there and the religious inflection that happens there? There's a really fascinating Catholic-Protestant interplay happening in those regions. Could you talk about how that kind of unfolds?
Sure, that idea of the backyard, it's a very common metaphor that is used. And the other one that is used, particularly for the Caribbean, it's borrowed from Soviet history. And they used to refer to areas like Eastern Europe as near abroad. So they're not exactly foreign, but they're sort of, and particularly in the 20s and 30s, a lot of left-wing American thinkers, they do these very stunning analyses of American control over most of the Western Hemisphere, and it is a remarkable degree of control. It is one of the miracles of American history that Cuba is never fully absorbed into the American Union. There are plans to absorb Cuba right from, I believe, about 1800.
Wow.
America occupies, dominates, de facto rules it right the way through much of the 19th, early 20th. And that then has lots of implications in terms of relations with Latino people within the United States, in terms of attitudes to Catholicism. So while Americans are fervently denying that they have these imperialist ambitions, they're actually running one of the world's largest empires, which is informal empire. And one of the great arms for that is something that I've not really talked about, which is mission.
Yeah.
Mission and empire overlap so much. Not, of course, to say that the goals of most missionaries are in any way cynical or overtly imperial, but inevitably they overlap so greatly.
Yeah. And so specifically, that unfolds in really dramatic ways, I think of in the Pacific region. So could you explain, how are missions and missionaries maybe unwittingly playing a role in the expansion of American empire?
The classic example is Hawaii, which is the first and most dramatic colonial possession of the United States after the completion of the Continental Project. Missionaries arrive there, Protestant white missionaries in the 1820s. They achieve a lot of success. And two things happen. One is that the missionaries themselves are entirely, honest and sincere, and this is what they want. But they achieve a cultural hegemony, and they and their families achieve a commercial economic dominance. So by the 1860s, 70s, 80s, it is the sons and grandsons of those missionaries who are completely dominating Hawaii as an extractive colony, in which a large part of the native population is dying out because it cannot withstand forced labor, it cannot withstand exposure to alcohol, and you get new populations drawn in. And you actually have missionary writers, one of whom I talk about at the end of the century, who says what a wonderful success the missions in Hawaii have been. It's sad that most of the Hawaiians have died out, but we must keep.
Oh, goodness. Oh, man.
But then at the end of the century, in the 1880s, 1890s, it is those great families, and you know one very well, which is Dole of Dole Pineapple, and they're the missionary offshoot families. They organize a coup which sets up an American-dominated government. And it's from that point, 1893, that you get the classic image of American Marines sent in to control a restive Third World territory. And 1898, Hawaii is absorbed into the United States.
Wow.
But you cannot write that story without the missions. Not what the missionaries do, but the power they establish, the culture they establish, and the families they establish. And it's a heart-rending story. And some of the great American writers, like, for instance, Melville, is appalled by what's happening, which he's seen. And he basically says, look, I've seen, he doesn't use the word, genocide inflicted on Native Americans, genocide inflicted on Hawaiians. Where else are the Christians going next?
Yeah.
Very harrowing.
one of the things that's really remarkable about your book is you have a lot of incredible cartoons from the periods and some really harrowing ones, thinking about some that depicted the atrocities in the Philippines,
Yep.
Of large scale murder and killing, all kind of intertwined with both imperial political ambitions, missions. I suppose the stereotypical story would be missionaries go, they establish a presence there, and then there's some kind of act of violence against them or their interest, and then the military steps in to protect them, and then all of a sudden now there's a permanent military presence. Sure. And that seems to be the kind of stereotypical mode in which that can kind of unfold. But I suppose that it is more complex than that. Like there are overlapping motivations and concerns. But then also, interestingly, one thing that your book brings out is that there's also, you use the phrase empires come home or empires strike back, that there's actually, it's not always a one-way street of influence, that the influence goes two ways. So could you talk about the ways that America itself has been influenced by its imperial periphery?
Sure. You mentioned those cartoons and the massacres, and I come back to one thing I said, which is this idea of dialogue. It is Protestant evangelical churches which are so furiously driving this very gung-ho approach to take over the Philippines for the sake of mission. But so much of the opposition to that movement is run from churches. So it's the churches themselves that are fighting so hard. And I talked about empires coming back. I use one trivial example. Well, not a trivial example. It's kind of interesting. If you ever drive in a state like Pennsylvania or the Midwest, and you're pulled over by a state police officer, then he or she is wearing what we might call a Smokey Bear hat. The reason they're doing that is because that was the uniform cap of the Philippine State Constabulary in 1900 that was designed to perform counterinsurgency. And when they had to design a force to suppress labor unions in the United States in the early years of the century, they brought back a lot of those Philippine constabulary veterans with their uniforms.
Wow.
And these people were, to use a phrase that grew out of that war, gung-ho, and they couldn't wait to fight in the more outlying regions of areas like Pennsylvania, which they called in the good Philippine term, the boonies.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing.
So empires come home, and I use that one example, as I said, of the Philippine War. Anything you ever look at that has a military feeling in the United States has those imperial badges. And again, you sort of think, how far back should you go? Is every American Western, every John Wayne cavalry movie, a movie about establishing the frontiers of empire? If not, why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. But this isn't just confined to the 19th century or the early 20th century. You write and chronicle this dynamic all the way through the Cold War. Could you talk about how that plays out then in relation to communism and the Cold War, and particularly thinking about Latin America and then, of course, Vietnam, where these are very huge issues? Could you talk about that?
Oh, boy, yes. I could write a book.
We're glad that you have written a book.
Thank you. Well, in terms, as I say, of ideologies of empire, the U.S. very vociferously is not attempting to create or rule a formal empire in the Cold War years. They're not in Vietnam to establish rule over Vietnam. But the power of American projection during the Cold War, with the bases here, the domination here, the intelligence power here, is arguably the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. It is, in terms of being dots, it's what one leading scholar calls a pointillist empire. It is painted with dots on the map. In terms of the ideology of anti-communism, there's a very strong heritage from the 19th century ideas, not exactly manifest destiny, but in terms of how we imagine and demonize enemies. Once again, so much of the politics of intervention and anti-intervention is fought out in religions and churches. In the 1970s and the 80s, for example, the main battlefront of the Cold War is in Central America. You have very large wars being fought by American proxy forces in countries like Guatemala and Salvador and Nicaragua. And so much of the opposition to those interventions happens within, especially, the Roman Catholic Church. So one international religious entity is providing the main ideological challenge to what you could call American empire. In the early 1980s, for example, there are some famous murders of leading Catholics in Central America, which do more than anything else to drive congressional opinion in the U.S. against supporting U.S. intervention. The murder of 4 American nuns and church workers in 1980, the progressive withdrawal of official funding to the Reagan administration is driven by events like that. And that then in turn leads to something like the Iran-Contra scandal. It's almost as if what happens on the imperial frontier comes home.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah. And it does come home. I mean, it continues to influence the ways that religion plays out in America. You have a really interesting section in your book on the influence of Eastern religions in America, the New Age movement, Buddhism in America. But again, the interesting ways in which that's a two-way street and that influence is moving back and forth.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about some of that? Because that wouldn't necessarily connect. I would not have, prior to reading your book, maybe just because I'm not well informed on this, but, would not have necessarily connected those movements with American imperialism.
Well, first of all, boy, where to start? Empire in large, unsettled or lightly settled areas needs migrants and needs labor. It needs people who will work cheaply. And that means a lot of immigration, of inviting foreign populations in, and inviting Asian populations in. Don't forget, we tend to think of Buddhism and Japanese populations in Hawaii, for example. They get there because the American commercial exploitation has largely destroyed the original native Hawaiian population. They need labor. They need Japanese, Asian populations. They bring in Buddhism in a very big way, and that's one of the early creations. America kicks open the door to Japan in the 1850s, forcing them to negotiate with the rest of the world. The Japanese, being an extremely creative and active people, study their enemy carefully, absorb from it what they think they can use and need. And a lot of Japanese religious thinkers admire what they see in American culture in themes like transcendentalism, this strange mystical idea. Some of the great Zen teachers who influenced the United States are Zen influenced by transcendental. So transcendentalism goes from New England to Japan, and is then greeted back in the United States with, "Oh, what a wonderful idea. We never thought of any of this."
Oh, wow.
And that two-way system works all the way through. And again, it's from the American occupation in World War II of Japan that you get the great wave of post-war Buddhism that we think of in terms of, Kerouac and the Beatniks. So there are these kind of complex interactions all the way. It need not be connected with direct occupation. But one of the great cultural tendencies in America from the 1920s on is the absorption of Native American spiritualities And I sometimes summarize the history of white American attitudes on native religion from, oh my God, they're worshipping the devil, to, oh, let's build a sweat lodge.
Right.
And when you look at the diverse alternative cultures of the 1960s, for example, the Buddhism, the kind of beat Buddhism, the Native American ideas, all these in different ways are different strata from imperial expansion and encounter, and empires and religions striking back. And all the way through, appropriation is a very controversial idea these days. Very strong appropriation at every stage. And again, often mediated through popular culture.
Through film, through cartoons.
Through film, yeah. And
novels.
And by the time you get to the 1950s and 60s, by television.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so kind of coming toward the end of the book, you make the point that in very modern times, so more recently, really since maybe 2020, there has been, particularly among Christian populations in the U.S., a real attempt to reckon with America's racial history. But you make the point that there has not been an equivalent attempt to reckon with America's imperial history.
Right.
In large part because we just don't think of ourselves as an empire, because we don't have an emperor. So how could we be an empire if we don't have, there's no Julius Caesar. So the question that I came away from that is not asking you to be a sort of leader for the ecumenical movement here, but what would a reckoning with America's imperial history entail?
By the way, when I talk about that, I'm comparing it with European countries where there is much more of a front and center recognition that racial history is imperial history, and the two are absolutely inseparable. And America is different because when it absorbs slaves, it's not doing it from colonized American territories in Africa, whatever. So it's seen very, very differently. What I would really like to see, not even some kind of breast beating, but this is something else dreadful that has happened in history, but applying the concept of what empire is, what it has been, and how it has shaped what churches look like, what denominations have succeeded in the United States and what have failed, I would regard as, in many ways, a function of that history of empire. And I make this argument, for example, about the two great Protestant traditions, Baptist and Methodist. You can only see those as what I call religions born in space. By which I mean religions formed in the great wide open spaces of empire, where the narrow institutional hierarchical religions could not possibly fit. So
right.
I say religions in space. But the most important thing I would like to see is for people to use the word. Is to think about empire. I know first-class historians who have the attitude of, well, in the 1930s, 1940s, America had a sort of empire, but it wasn't much compared to the British or the French. And if you're just thinking of the Philippines, well, no, absolutely not. But if you think of an America which includes all the California and Texas and Alaska, all of which in their day were imperial. When did that imperial quality cease?
Yeah, it's a huge theoretical question.
Right.
Which maybe leads to my last question about your kind of the theory of empire at work here. But you hear a lot today about Christian nationalism as a reality in the U.S. Is an analysis of Christian imperialism, is that theoretically different than an analysis of Christian nationalism? And how might the understanding of America as an empire that you're proposing today help us grapple with this question of Christian nationalism and how that relates to America in our current political moment?
I find Christian nationalism a very difficult topic to discuss because the definitions tend to shift so much. It's partly, again, a historical vision, very often based on a very bad reading of documents, and it produces, if you like, an exclusive version of what national identity is. That is separate from a Christian imperial vision, I think. But the most important thing I would emphasize is that you cannot possibly look at the Christian imperial vision without looking at the anti-imperial vision, which emerges at the same time. They are inseparable twins, and it is a series of dialogues. So, if you like, twin sisters who have been fighting each other from birth, and which manifests in different ways. Why that is different now is because such a large part of the American population is people who are themselves the heirs of empire and the heirs of colonized populations. If you look at America's African populations, yes, but so much of our European descended populations are the descendants of empire. Latin American populations, empire is our story.
And so learning to tell that story.
Right. And
Honestly.
It's the story of our religions and our churches, again, for better or worse.
Yeah. And so perhaps part of that reckoning, as you say, would be to use the word, to learn to tell the story honestly and as well-rounded a way as possible.
And I will retitle my book, The E Word.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for a really fascinating conversation and a truly delightful, at times harrowing, but a really remarkable book, this account of American empire and American faith. So thank you, and thank you for your time. This book is available at BaylorPress.com. It is currently available for pre-order. Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.